4 weeks ago, something terrifying happened. Craziak expressed an opinion about things that he likes. Though this utter blasphemy has fallen into the depths, something even more terrifying is coming. He's going to talk about things that he dislikes. For those who are fearful, turn back now. For those brave enough, proceed into the depths.
Hey! Stop it! Stop it! Ugh. Enough of your shenanigans. Jeez. Sorry about that. Anyhow, since I already covered the top 7 most impressive dungeons in Elsword, I thought it couldn't possibly hurt to cover the top 7 least impressive dungeons in Elsword. But it did hurt. A lot. So, enjoy the fruits of my painstaking labor. Keeping in mind once again that these are pre-revamped versions of the dungeons, here are the top 7 least impressive dungeons in Elsword.
Number 7. Palace Entrance. I know what you're asking yourself right now. Which stage is that one? And that's precisely why this dungeon is so poor. You see, even a bad dungeon is typically memorable. As you'll see in some of the remaining 6, bad dungeons leave an unpleasant taste in your mouth and you seldom forget them. But the Palace Entrance is just so forgettable that its quality can only be described as poor. What do I mean? Well, in the top 7 best dungeons video, I referenced the stage in saying that its environment was very flat and empty compared to later Velder dungeons with the same atmosphere. Not only do those seem more developed, but also vary more greatly as their dungeons progress. From the start to end of Palace Entrance, I feel no progression, not even during the boss fight, which is also very unremarkable. The mobs are pretty boring, though I'll give them credit for being at least somewhat new. They're palette swaps, sure, but at least they fit the burning attack atmosphere and are different enough from the previous 2 Velder dungeons that led up to this one. The music here is a decent piece, but I feel it fits better with Burning Hope Bridge. Still, it's not a terrible choice. While this dungeon could definitely use some improvement to make it a little more memorable, it's not terrible and it doesn't belong any higher up than 7th place on this list. Number 6. Cargo Airship. While at first the cargo airship might not seem that bad, I find that it suffers 2 major issues. The first is that while it employs new visuals, it doesn't really do them in a remarkable way. Compare this to the second issue that it essentially feels like a lazy implementation of the Black Crow, which story-wise takes place right after this stage and seems to employ visuals and mobs in a better way. The cargo airship does have at least one new mob, the Nasad B, to its credit. However, the other Nasads are reused or palette swapped from the previous Bethma dungeon, Richie Mine. Additionally, many of them don't even seem to make sense here. This is an airship built for transporting cargo. Why are there miners drilling into the hull? Both the Black Crow and the cargo airship have 2 pieces of music, and they share the same ones, and neither is really remarkable. They do sort of fit the feel of the stage, I guess, but even having done the dungeon many times, I still don't find them memorable or unique, given the effort put into a lot of other dungeon pieces. Lastly, the cargo airship's visuals are really lacking. Since this is the first time we're up in the sky or even around large machines, the dungeon shares a common flaw with the palace entrance in that progression seems absent, except for the machinery inside the ship, which is somewhat neat. The ship is basically entirely just blue and orange painted hull pieces against a piercingly unfitting sapphire blue backdrop sky. This dungeon doesn't commit any major sins, but it's just all around unremarkable, and given the fact that the Black Crow, an arguably better dungeon, immediately follows it, it sure doesn't do a very good job of making itself distinct. Number 5. Sunken Resum. Sunken Resum is one of the most shocking dungeons in the game. To demonstrate why I picked such an unusual adjective, let's look distinctly at each of the 3 categories that I've been assessing in these dungeons. The mobs are mostly new and fit perfectly into this atmosphere. We're greeted by mermen, multiple types of fish, and other water-based creatures which are very well suited to the underwater nature of this dungeon. Later on, we're shown some shadow creatures, which is a tad lazy but forgivable. That said, this dungeon does suffer in its excessive use of the Lugus and Is mobs, which knock you down frequently enough to just be frustrating. Still, it's inarguable that these mobs do fit into this atmosphere. Speaking of fitting into the atmosphere, the music here is astonishing. It fits the scenery perfectly and captures wholly the idea that you are battling your way through the underwater city of Atlantis. I mean Hamel. It's calm, serene, and complements the dungeon perfectly from start to end. Last up is the visual ambience of this dungeon. This dungeon takes place entirely underwater, which is unique to the game. The following dungeon does have underwater segments, but not to the same degree, and certainly not with the same ambience. The visuals here are completely unique and quite stunning. Fish homes, seaweed, mossy rocks, sunken buildings, and all kinds of underwater life can be found here, despite not appearing in any other dungeon. And even though the backgrounds behind the stage itself are murky, there's still a decent amount of detail put into things that one would hardly notice if missing. Hearing all this, you'd think that you would suddenly switch videos. The visuals are great, the music is excellent, and the mobs only suffer from being overwhelmed by lagoos and irritants. So what's the deal, Craziac? Why did you include this masterpiece? Because of the bloody damn water physics. Oh my word, these are astonishingly bad. Having played a variety of games from Mario 64 to Indiana Jones, I've experienced in excess of 100 water physics implementations, and by golly, Elsword takes the cake. Water slows you down, which, despite being reasonably realistic, is just a pain in the ass in a combo and skill-driven game engine like this one. Jumping is also a pain, given how used to the standard jumping mechanic you are by this point. And doing attacks in the air makes you unable to move after execution, which means if there's a waterborne enemy above you, it can take a good 30 seconds for melee-based attackers to do any decent damage to it. Realistically, this whole situation just messes with the mechanics of the game. It makes comboing hard and jumping difficult, and skills suffer as a result. Now you can see why I call this dungeon shocking. It takes genuine skill to take a beautifully crafted masterpiece of a dungeon and add one single mechanic that manages to make it painful enough to end up on some idiot's top 7 failures list. Sunken Resum, I want to like you, I really do, but I just can't. Come on now, don't be sad, it's not you, it's... Okay, it's you. Next up. Number 4. Return planes. While we're on the topic of things I want to like, let's take a look at the return planes. No, not that one. That's the Alterra planes. There's a huge difference. The return planes have more floors. Like the cargo airship, this dungeon does a very good job of mimicking another. In this case, the Alterra planes. First though, let's take a moment to appreciate that the mobs here are at least different from the Alterra planes, except for the fact that they're just ripped directly from the Black Crow. I can't tell whether that's a point for or against this dungeon though. Either way, the mobs they stole are not very interesting and really don't even feel fitting here. I guess they're excusable since they don't feel particularly unfitting either, but again, that's not really a good point for this dungeon. The music is also different from the Alterra planes, and quite honestly, it's not that bad. It's not my favorite music in the game, quite obviously, but it's at least not terrible, and it doesn't detract from the stage. It might fit better in another dungeon, but it works here, so I can't complain. However, this dungeon falls apart in, oddly enough, the area that it shares most with Alterra planes, its visuals. Look into the vast, forbidden expanse of the land, and notice the lovely grass, and trees, and spire, and a couple fallen ships. Do you like these trees, grass, spire, and ships? Well good, because that's all you're going to see for 13 damn floors of this dungeon. From start to end, there is nothing remarkable, nothing unique, and nothing interesting about the visuals of the return planes. They are shared almost exactly with the Alterra planes, and even then, they're too repetitive to be done well. With all that said, if you thought this dungeon shared some similarities with another, just wait until the next pick. Number 3. Spiral Corridor. Dear Spiral Corridor, why do you exist? I've been searching for a reason, but despite my best efforts, I just can't reconcile your existence. I implore you to help me see the light. Signed, Craziac. Seriously, this dungeon doesn't even need to be in the game. It chronologically follows the Shrine of Dedication entrance dungeon, and I'm pretty sure if these two were sitting together during an exam, they just look like this. The mobs that appear in Spiral Corridor are identical to those in the Shrine of Dedication entrance. Seriously, they use the exact same 6 mob types, all 6 of which were, incidentally, introduced in the Shrine entrance. Admittedly, I think the glitter mobs all work really well here, but only for the exact same reason that they worked in the Shrine entrance. On to the music. Oh, looky here! Spiral Corridor also utilizes the exact same music track from the Shrine entrance. What, you think I'm kidding? Nope, they are the exact same track. Well, how about the visuals? Surely something must be different. Well, yes, you're in luck. The textures are slightly tinted purple here, whereas in the Shrine entrance, they were tinted slightly teal blue. Wait, what? The textures are identical. The model's identical. Even the background looks exactly the bloody same. I mean, come on! Does this dungeon have anything unique to it? Well, yes. Instead of utilizing falling walls like the entrance, which were admittedly really annoying, it instead utilizes confusing portals that warp you to different sections of each floor. And based on the number of times I've played that dungeon, I know I'm not the only one who was initially confused about which way to go to actually advance and eventually leave the floor. And while I'm not focusing much on bosses, I do want to take this moment to mention that Teach the Tyrant is a much more boring boss than Durahan. This dungeon is flat out redundant. The only real difference from the shrine entrance that it has to its name is just a complete irritant. I can't believe I almost put this dungeon in 4th place. Number 2. Bethma Lake Night. Wait, seriously? It's called Bethma Lake Night? Wow, seriously, they're making this way too easy. This stage is just Bethma Lake, with a low brightness tint added. Oh, and you fight running left instead of right. But legitimately, everything else is exactly the same. Most of the mobs are repeated like the Komodos and Lizardmen, and while they're quite fitting in the atmosphere, the repetition and lack of effort put into creating an interesting and engaging dungeon is blatantly obvious. Not to mention, both the boss and his stage are reused resources as well. The dungeon does use different music from its daytime counterpart, and, though it's not the same, I have to give the daytime dungeon credit for having a far more fitting theme. I mean, come on, the nighttime music was reused in Altera Core. How fitting can it be of a nighttime desert dungeon? And the visuals, they are literally identical. If you ran Bethma Lake Night screenshots through a filter, it would just look like the daytime version. The distant background is the same, the docks are the same, the water is the same, and so on. I mean, well, yeah, they're supposed to be the same since it's theoretically the same location at a different time of day, but the point is that it shouldn't be. Honestly, I really feel like I haven't said much here. There's not much to say. Bethma Lake Night is Bethma Lake, at night. But the blatant, unrelenting repetition of these elements is honestly frustrating. Many players make multiple characters and, as such, have to repeat the start of the game enough already. What purpose does it serve to actually add a repetition of a stage that differs so insignificantly from the first rendition? To summarize, it's just a carbon copy of the previous dungeon with no unique traits of its own. It's unoriginal, unnecessary, and repetitive, just like this summary. And the number 1 most unimpressive Elsword dungeon is... the Suburbs of Wally's Castle. The problems with this dungeon are so blatantly obvious that I think I'll just go get a soda while you guys look at images of the dungeon and facepalm repeatedly. Okay, I'm not actually getting a soda, I already have one anyway. Like Spiral Corridor and Bethma Lake Night, this dungeon looks identical to another stage, Wally's Castle itself. I guess the Suburbs are supposed to be an atmosphere setter leading up to the castle itself and the final Battle of Elder. I'll give the stage credit, it does not use the same mobs as its counterpart, but there's so many other things in play here that it's hardly even worth bringing that up. Let's start with the biggest flaw of the mobs in the Suburbs. William Foru is the mini-boss. Yes, the same William Foru that you fought in the Forest Ruins. The same William Foru that is the boss fight of the Suburbs. And yes, even the same William Foru that randomly spawns in dungeons when you get a bad random seed after picking up a power-up. And yes, he's a Foru, just like the Django and Kid Foru mobs that litter this dungeon. Literally, if they were legally recognized as trash, this dungeon would be a landfill. Honestly, I don't like the music here, but I guess that's personal preference. It also uses 2 tracks, the same 2 tracks as Wally's Castle. Surprise, surprise. It fits the dungeon atmosphere, I guess, about exactly as well as it fits Wally's Castle. And the visuals, like Bethma Lake Night and Spiral Corridor, are literally identical. In fact, the Suburbs take place at nighttime in a nearly identical location with a nearly identical background and identical textures, models, and even layouts. In fact, I think the reason they gave it a nighttime atmosphere is because you literally would not be able to tell the 2 dungeons apart if they had the same lighting. Here, have a look. See? They're basically the same stage. For those of you who care, the one on the left is the true Wally's Castle, and the other is the blatant imposter that stands in her stead. Like with the Spiral Corridor and Bethma Lake Night, there's one thing I simply don't get. Why? I mean, sure, it saves you some production time. Okay, a lot of production time, but come on. Think of the players. Think of the children! They don't want to repeat dungeons on normal, hard, and very hard. What makes you think they want to repeat them twice for each difficulty? Here's the bottom line. If you're going to explicitly make a dungeon, make it its own dungeon with its own uniqueness. Perhaps it wasn't even fair of me to include Sunken Resum on this list. At least it was trying to be different and unique, and hell, it succeeded. With our bottom 3, and a couple of the others to a lesser degree, there's just zero effort put into making the stages unique or interesting in any way. If it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess. Anyway, there are the top 7 least impressive dungeons in all of Elsword, those which exhibited poor creativity, poor quality, and poor mechanics. If you disagree, throw me a comment below and tell me how stupid I am. Or, heck, if you actually agree with me, click that little thumbs up button down there and let me know I'm not the only crazy one out there. And until the next video, guys, I'll see you later.
You have done well, everybody. You are fearless, brave, and made it all the way to the end of this video. But why stop there? There's another editorial on the left, or a Let's Play series on the right. Feel free to dive right in and enjoy all that Crazy Ike has to offer.